My life is good, I write was hood, I might get to it, not out the woods, so bro, I got to do it, be a monster, that's why my mantra.
Welcome to 3Con Commentaries. Today we're going to talk about the Steiner brothers, which appeared on A&E's Biography, which aired June the 30th, 2024. Because they didn't go into too many of the controversies, and the controversies are what makes the Steiner brothers very interesting. We're going to have to go into that here. We're not going to go into any granular detail. We're going to basically do an overview of a lot of the issues that the two of them have gotten into. But the documentary, as far as a documentary is concerned, was actually very good. Of course, brought to my attention quite a few things that I didn't know. Overall, I liked it, though it felt a bit thin. Now, because we're talking about two separate people, I'm going to split the video into a Rick section and a Scott section. That way, we won't get things too mixed up. Let's start with Rick. Rick is the older of the two. He's older about like 18 months or about 2 years. He said he didn't watch wrestling as a kid. This was in a different interview. But Rick was the first one to get into pro wrestling. He got into pro wrestling in around 1983, 1984, where after he got injured on the wrestling team at U of M, he was looking for something to do. He met George the Animal Steel, who suggested he goes talk to Vern Gagne, who runs, of course, the AWA training camp. I learned from some extra reading that he was actually trained by Eddie Sharkey and Brad Rangans at Minneapolis. He's wrestling, and Scott is watching him on TV. The Steiner brothers wrestled at home. They had like carpets in the basement that they used to wrestle on, but neither one of them really saw themselves getting into pro wrestling. Rick got into it basically to continue being athletic, and Rick meets his wife while he's on the Tulsa circuit, and he has been married to her ever since. They actually start teaming up in 1989 as the Steiner brothers. Rick had bounced around in many of the territories during this time. Of course, after they are one of the greatest tag teams of all time, probably top 2 or 3 WCW tag teams of all time. And they're broken up in the late 90s because they had done everything that there was to do as a tag team. So it was time to sort of go their own way. And so in 1998, they were broken up at Super Brawl. And mostly Rick worked as a mid-carder, TV champ, US champ kind of thing, until the end of WCW. But during this time, before 1998, he had actually gotten into real estate in like 1995. At the behest of the Big Boss Man and some of the other guys in the business, as a way to sort of create a nest egg and a retirement for himself. And that's what he did during the years where Scott was still wrestling. Rick wrestled sporadically, but for the most part, he was doing real estate and was wrestling on the side. So there's not much to really talk about when it comes to Rick outside of wrestling. After the closure of WCW, he popped up in TNA here and there. He worked some indies here and there. We'll talk about one of the incidents that he had at an indie show soon. But in 2016, Rick Steiner did an interview with Slam Wrestling as he was talking about his background, his life, etc. And he mentioned that, when you're wrestling, amateur wrestling, you're taught to be very aggressive, to tear apart your competition. And he struggled with learning how to do the psychology of entertainment wrestling. And he talked about that's why he liked working in Japan, is because in Japan, they work stiff. And the Steiner brothers get to be as stiff as they want in Japan. So there's a lot of stories about the Steiner brothers bullying job guys, beating up job guys. And they just like to work stiff. That's what he was saying is, this is how we work. We like the competition part of it. So we like to go in there and lay stuff in. And some guys don't know how to handle that. And so there's a lot of stories like, one I'm about to talk about in a second, where Scott was rough with a guy. But it wasn't because he was trying to shoot on him or trying to be a bully. It's just they work stiff. So in 2005, Scott got into it with a guy by the name of Vordell Walker at an indie show. So Vordell Walker and Rick Steiner were in a tag team match against each other. and Rick was working very stiff. He even kicked Vordell Walker in the mouth, and was verbally berating him for, not really being able to give back. What he didn't know was that Vordell Walker was a trained mixed martial artist and actually had a shoot background himself. So when Rick was shooting on him, he would shoot back. And, Rick found himself in some very interesting situations as he was being tied up by this kid. Rick Steiner was 41 years old at the time. Vordell Walker was 24. You can find the entire story by Mike Mooningham if that's what you're interested in. But it's told basically from Vordell Walker's perspective that he had no idea why Rick Steiner was doing that, and that Rick had been aggravated with him all day, him and a couple of the other young guys. And it's another thing that kind of goes into the Steiner brothers, that they like to rough up young boys. And since Walker is so much younger than Rick, he figured he was going to rough him up. And Vordell Walker felt disrespected, like Rick was being really rough with him. And so they started tussling, and he got the better of Rick here and there. The match went on. Things got more and more heated. And then eventually, the other two guys, one of whom was Dustin Rhodes, actually worked the match, ended the match or whatever. And after the match, Vordell Walker claims that he went into the locker room and challenged Rick Steiner to a fight, to which Rick Steiner declined, but, he gave him some time to go calm down. And then him and Raven, I guess, who had worked the show as well, went to try to talk to Vordell Walker about it. But by that point in time, he was pretty much upset and was refusing to talk to him. And that's pretty much the story, is that, Rick Steiner pretty much kicked this kid in the face and was being really rough with him in the ring. And the guy had to shoot back and was ready to basically choke out Rick Steiner in order to stop him from attacking him. But, it's one of those things where, was he shooting on him for real, trying to hurt him for real? Or is it that Rick just plays too rough? And this is a common theme with the Steiner brothers. There's going to be other stories later where they're messing around, they're joking, but they're incredibly strong, and you can't tell if they're playing around or if it's serious. So this Vordell Walker took it seriously, and him and Rick never worked again. Apparently this Vordell Walker used to work in Ring of Honor. And this is pretty much the only story that I was able to find on him. I haven't seen or heard anything more about this guy. So this was a very interesting story. Of course, the big incident with Rick occurred in 2023 when he ended up getting banned from WrestleCon for verbally harassing Giselle Shaw, who is a transgendered wrestler who claims that Rick Steiner was yelling at Giselle that Giselle was filth and that Giselle was trash, and had called another wrestler a faggot. Rick Steiner was then, of course, asked to not come back for WrestleCon, and then was out and out banned from the events from that day forward. Chris Jericho came out during this time and said that Rick Steiner and Scott Steiner, basically the Steiner brothers in general, were just generally being bullies, and that they often would bully guys like himself and Chris Benoit and Rey Mysterio and Juventud Guerrera. Specifically, he noted the World War III 1997 show. He didn't say what these guys did to him, but he basically said that, hey, this is what the Steiner brothers do. They're bullies. Kevin Nash told the story of Rick and Scott Steiner shoving a pencil up the ass of a referee that they were bullying. This was also confirmed by Eric Bischoff that this actually did occur. They didn't say which referee it was, but apparently the Steiners had hogtied some referee backstage and shoved the pencil up his ass. Absolutely psychotic behavior. Bret Hart had written in his book that the Steiner brothers were trying to get out of their WWF contracts, but Vince wouldn't let them out. So then they beat up job guys and basically forced Vince to let them go. And so this was a recurring thing, that they were bullies and beating guys up. They talked about Rick beating up the Freebirds in tag team matches and stuff like this, where he got the nickname Gremlin. That was talked about in the documentary. But it was Michael Hayes telling the story, and it was obviously told in a way that was kind of humorous. But this sort of routine behavior from the Steiner brothers was pretty much noted by and documented over the years. Now, Scott Steiner is actually a little bit more detailed for obvious reasons. Scotty got into a lot more trouble than Rick did. But going back to his life, he's 16 to 18 months younger than Rick. He was more prolific as an amateur wrestler. In an interview with Slam Wrestling, he mentioned that he didn't go into the Olympics because he wanted to actually make money. And he said that he actually liked watching pro wrestling because Rick was involved. So he watched it in college. But they didn't really watch pro wrestling as kids. Rick didn't like pro wrestling. But Scott liked it, and he liked it because Rick was involved. And he said it in the documentary that he really went into pro wrestling because Rick was already in. But he ended up going to Florida and training. And it was a little while, I think like 2 or 3 years, before they met up in 1989 as the Steiner brothers. They were the Steiner brothers for a little while, and then Bill Watts kind of frustrated Scott Steiner. He was frustrated because of Eric Watts. They didn't like Eric Watts, and they felt like Eric Watts was getting favoritism because he was getting pushed, even though he didn't have any talent. And the Steiner brothers were doing crazy stuff like duct taping guys backstage, and Bill Watts was trying to really bring the hammer down. So Scotty blew up on Bill Watts, and then basically the Steiner brothers left to go to the WWF. They felt like they wanted more money from the WWF. They weren't going to get it, which led to them trying to get out of their contracts. And according to Bret Hart, they just beat up job guys until they eventually let them go. Scott Steiner would become the solo star in 1998. I like that Rick said that he was never jealous of Scott, even though, you could tell that people liked Scott more. He was the more athletic of the two, the more energetic of the two, the more charismatic of the two. And Scott said that he always felt that Rick was too passive, that Rick let things go, which is crazy considering the stuff that Rick Steiner is accused of and the stuff Scott Steiner is going to be accused of, and the fact that they're shoving pencils up people's asses. But Scott still felt like WCW took advantage of Rick and didn't give Rick the same opportunities. They discussed the physical change in Scott Steiner, which was very noticeable in WCW from Big Papa Pump. He still refuses to admit that he did steroids. In the documentary, he says he never failed a drug test and that he was on a strict diet. Scott said that the Big Papa Pump character was legit because he never had any thoughts of getting married, even though he did eventually get married in 2000. But he said he never really had any ideas about getting married. Scott Steiner was known for being very aggressive, very paranoid, especially during his time in WCW. He was very upset with the booking and would often complain. Of course, he would fly off the handle during promos on television and kind of had a reputation for being a loose cannon. He was very full of animosity. He always had a chip on his shoulder. But when he became the world champion, he felt like all of his hard work had finally paid off. And that was good for him. He discussed his WWF run, but he gave us a little bit of an excuse that we didn't know a thing about, that he had severe nerve damage in his foot from his final days in WCW. And he felt like the feeling in his foot was never going to come back. But he wanted to be a company guy and went out there and worked the final Nitro. Now, something they did not discuss in the documentary, and something that I looked up later, is Scott actually talked about wanting to retire due to this foot injury. But the WWF offered him so much money. It was more money than he had even asked them for. That's why he came back and started getting into the WWF. Of course, that ended up being an absolute disaster. The 2002, 2003, 2004 Scott Steiner run ended up being a disaster. This leads to him going to TNA, where he said he wanted to show that the WWF run wasn't his best and that he could do better than that. And but his foot was still paralyzed throughout the entire time, and he ended up having 3 surgeries on his foot in order to get feeling back in his foot after he left the WWF. And he talked about nearly dying in Puerto Rico after this wrestler named Apollo kicked him in his throat, and he had to have surgery He said he wrestled like 2 or 3 months after that. And so from there, they kind of skipped into the Hall of Fame, where Scott said that he didn't want, even though he knew he had this reputation for being a bit of a psycho, he wasn't going to say anything at the Hall of Fame that was going to jeopardize the career of his nephew. And that's why he was sort of mellowed out at the Hall of Fame, which is incredibly intelligent and, makes sense. So he felt comfortable going into the Hall of Fame in, I think it was 2022. So Rick and Scott Steiner went into the Hall of Fame. But Scott Steiner was not, he was not one to mellow out soon. After his WWF run, shortly before his time in TNA, I think he was in TNA at the time, he did an interview with Slam Wrestling when he talked about Triple H being an incredibly insecure guy who only got a job because he was banging the boss's daughter, and that Vince McMahon is surrounded by yes men, and that the company is worse now than when he was there. Because again, this was in 2006. In 2012, Scott Steiner was sued by TNA. He had done an interview in May of 2012 with Slam Wrestling, in which he went on an absolute tirade against Hulk Hogan, Eric Bischoff, and Bruce Pritchard, calling them all pieces of shit and con artists. He talked about TNA giving away tickets in Nashville, but it could only get 2,500 to 3,000 people to show up. He said that Hogan thinks he's bigger than the business, but he's not a draw anymore. He was upset that he couldn't talk to Dixie Carter one-on-one anymore, because he always had to go through Bruce Pritchard, who he called a gopher, and said he was only a gopher in WWF. He called Eric Bischoff's son Garrett a stupid ass, and lambasted Eric Bischoff for booking his son into angles and talking about how terrible Garrett Bischoff was, that he was too ineffectual to even throw a clothesline correctly. He said he felt insulted for having to wrestle that guy, and that Bischoff insulted the boys by forcing the guys to wrestle him. He said he saw the same thing in WCW, so that's why he's leaving TNA, because he's not going down with this ship like he went down with WCW. He called Hogan a pull string doll. This is so humorous that I have to read the quote. So the context of Scott Steiner going off on Hulk Hogan is Hulk Hogan apparently had made some disparaging comments about Kurt Angle. So Scott Steiner goes on a tirade saying, because Hogan once confronted, said he got tongue-tied. So Steiner says, "Are you crazy? That's the thing. Hogan is like a pull string doll. You pull the string, and if he isn't saying take your vitamins and say your prayers, or brother, or what you're going to do, he sounds like a complete idiot." That's classic Scott Steiner. That's tremendous. And in any event, WCW sued him for this, claiming that his remarks caused damage to the company, and that in his contract he had a non-disparagement clause in his contract that he could not talk negatively about TNA. Scott Steiner then countered by saying that his contract had expired when he made these comments. And in addition to that, all of the parties involved, Hogan, Bischoff, and Bruce Pritchard, none of them had worked in the company at the time that this lawsuit was filed. And considering nobody works there, like, how can you do any damage to the company? In 2016, this lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice. Scott Steiner ended up countersuing TNA for unpaid royalties. I don't know what the outcome of that was, but I assume it was probably settled out of court. In 2017, Scott Steiner refused to go into the WWE Hall of Fame because there was no physical building. And he cited that Stephanie McMahon and Hunter McMahon are both fucking idiots, and that Stephanie wears the pants, which is why he calls Triple H Hunter McMahon. He then doubled down and called Dixie Carter a mark who didn't know what she was doing. In 2015, Scott Steiner was banned from the WWE Hall of Fame because he has supposedly made a threat towards Hulk Hogan. Scott claims that he had seen Hulk Hogan's wife and confronted her about Hogan accepting the invitation to induct Macho Man Randy Savage into the Hall of Fame, because everybody knows that Randy Savage hated Hulk Hogan. She claimed that he was making death threats, and Scott Steiner was banned from the Hall of Fame, which of course led him to make the subsequent derogatory statements about Triple H and Stephanie. In 2023, Disco Inferno on his podcast told a story of Scott Steiner drowning him in a pool during a WCW event. Scott Steiner confirmed that this actually did occur, but claims it was a rib and he was joking. He also said that at that same event, he had did something similar to Rick, so he didn't mean any harm when he did that to Disco. So you see, like, this history of both the Steiner brothers being accused of making off the wall comments, just being generally tough, irritable, ornery guys who bullied guys who were younger than them. But one thing that is consistent is they just had no patience for young talent. As if you were listening closely, Rick Steiner gets into it with a 24-year-old wrestler. They quit WCW because of Eric Watts. Scott Steiner is talking about David Flair. He's also talking about Garrett Bischoff. So you see, like, these young wrestlers, they just have no patience for these guys. And they're beating them up, and they're doing all kinds of stuff to them. Jericho was talking about, 1997, the Steiner brothers trying to, bully those guys, and they would have been the young guys at the time. So you see the Steiner brothers, they have a jock sense of humor where it's funny to them to duct tape people and hog tie folks and pretend to drown them, but you don't know whether it's because they're just generally assholes or are they just playing too rough. And they give you a sense of both, kind of. Like, they smile at the idea of duct taping a guy. They think that's funny. But it's never mentioned that some of the crazier things that they've been accused of doing, and they've been doing it for so long that there has to be some element of truth to it. I mean, they're even agreeing that some of these things actually happened. Like, the Disco Inferno thing is confirmed. The Kevin Nash thing is confirmed independently by Eric Bischoff. So some of this stuff actually did happen. So you're like, these guys are crazy, and since it's two of them, what on earth can you do? So, but the Steiner brothers, they rule. They're one of the greatest tag teams of all time. I like them. I wouldn't want to hang out with them because they seem like very dangerous company. But, they're two guys who are not marks for the business. They were not marks for themselves. They said what they felt, whether it was wanted or not. And it seems like they've mellowed out since they got older, even though this thing with Rick was literally within the last 18 months. But they seem to have mellowed out quite a bit, especially Scott. And they're both just sitting back watching Brian Breaker grow, which is amazing. And hopefully he could change the reputation of the Steiner family, because their reputation is not good. But what do you guys think of the biography? Let me know in the comment section. Like, share, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later. Peace out.